Hi, everybody. I'm Bryan Norcross, along with Luke Doris. This is podcast number 9 of Hurricane Season 2021 and podcast number 65 in our series. Today, we're going to do something different. I'm going to turn most of the podcast over to Luke. Luke?
Well, we've heard from so many interesting and knowledgeable people over the years, and our own Bryan fits squarely into that category. In fact, he's the golden goose of fascinating hurricane stories, including his own life. And I figure it's time we should dive into his career and his philosophy on hurricane coverage. And of course, Andrew, is quite a story to hear.
All right, we'll get to that in just a few minutes. All right, in a few days, we'll be at the 29th anniversary of Hurricane Andrew, if you can believe that. So today, we're going to do part 1 of our talk, where we're going to talk about that and the years that led up to it.
Yeah, the story of Andrew is a lot to unpack there, but part of it I think that stands out to me is it's a cautionary tale of forecast uncertainty, as we'll get into in the days before, as a small and weak storm. They can be tricky, and sometimes they do turn into buzzsaws quickly. And I wonder if it were to happen today, if it would catch more people by surprise in a bigger way, because people expect more lead time and forecast accuracy, but still things like this could happen. And also, what is really striking to me is how the path of Bryan's life, the positions he was in leading up to Andrew, left him so well equipped when he most needed to be. And listen to how his story unfolds and see if you don't agree.
All right, we'll do that in just a few minutes. We're recording this podcast on Wednesday, August 18th, 2021. If you're listening at some point in the future, for the latest in South Florida, of course, tune into Channel 10 or anywhere. Local10.com has all of the Local 10 newscasts. And then there's the Max Tracker Hurricane app for the latest tropical information and the Local 10 Weather Authority app for your local weather information anywhere you are. And you can go to local10.com/hurricane and sign up for a newsletter that I write called From Bryan Norcross. You get that most every day because it seems like there's always something going on in the tropics this time of year. Scroll down to the middle of the page under the picture of the Local 10 weather team, and you can put in your email address, and we will email it to you whenever there is something of interest in the tropics. And things have certainly heated up and are going moderately strong here. Luke, first of all, now Hurricane Grace.
Yeah, Grace today. Before we get to Grace, I saw an interesting stat. Today's the 18th. On the 16th is when Henri became a storm, or I forget if it's the 16th or 17th. But anyway, there have only been 3 years where we've had 8 named storms up to that date, the 16th or the 17th. This year, last year, 2005. So we're in rarefied air again this year as far as pace of storms before by a certain date. So
yeah, in the modern era.
We have that.
I think 1936 or something, there was a, but we don't really have a lot of certainty about exactly what was going on in 1936. But in the satellite era, or where we do have much more, yeah, that's right. And if Henri turns into a hurricane, it will be the first time to have 3 hurricanes before August 20th.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
Assuming it turns into a hurricane today or tomorrow, or I don't know if the 20th is the cutoff or not. We'll count on Phil Klotzbach to update us on those stats.
He's the guru. So Grace became the second hurricane of the season. We had Elsa back in July, and Grace lashed the Cayman Islands this morning. Yesterday it was Jamaica as a tropical storm. Then this morning the Cayman Islands. Now it's moving west of there as a 75-mile-per-hour hurricane at this point, and moving over really warm water. It's got some dry air that it's battling, and aimed right toward the Yucatan Peninsula, give or take Cozumel.
Again. I mean, the 3 went over him last year, right? It was just craziness. I mean, right over them, not like skirting about over them. I mean, right over top of them 3 times last year.
I made a graphic for the noon newscast of Gamma, Delta, and Zeta, and you're right. It's not like you look at it and think, oh, they're kind of in the same they felt it's the center of the storm, almost on top of each other, 3 in a row. Last year, now Grace it looks to head right there too. So 4 in a year is remarkable.
It really is. It really, and for reasonably strong storms as well. And then we have Henri, which has the potential to be a hurricane. It's forecast to be a hurricane, and has the potential to significantly affect the Northeast and New England, which is a monstrous can of worms on a summer weekend in August, toward the end of summer. All along the New England coast, the New York coast, people rent their vacation homes years in advance. I mean, way in advance. So they count on certain weeks or certain weekends. And I can't even imagine what's going to go on if the trends continue, which is to bring Henri as a hurricane close to Long Island and the New England coast, because it's all going to happen this weekend. Like, the storm would be there on Sunday. So, full scale, whatever's going to happen, what is going to have to happen on Friday, if the GFS is right. Now, we're waiting as we speak here for the European to come in, but the trend of all the models has been to bring the storm in some fashion, whether it's a strong hurricane or whether it's, when I say strong, I mean a category 1-ish, 85 mile an hour hurricane, say, to the vicinity, or if it's a weaker storm. That kind of remains to be seen.
So what's going on here, Bryan? Is it that the models are, this has defied some odds. The models were thinking it was going to get sheared over. It's had quite a bit of shear, and it's fought that off. So is it the models are now catching on to that this is going to stay vertically stacked, at least to some degree, and then that changes its track? Or is it the steering flow and how complex it is? Or is it both? What do you think's going on? Why are we seeing this westward nudge as we get, just a few days down the line?
Well, you have two high pressure systems, and the models are changing the intensity of both high pressure systems. One, and the position. One is the one just over the Atlantic that's always there, called the Bermuda High or the Subtropical Ridge or the Bermuda Azores High. It just stretches across the Atlantic, and storms track around the left nose of it in some fashion. Well, if you go back and look at the models, you see that the high pressure is edging west a little bit, so that makes the nose of the high stick farther west, which makes the storm track closer to the U.S. East Coast. But then there's another high pressure system over Canada, and the newer model runs have the nose of that on the east side, kind of nosing out, blocking the forward path of Henri, so that it kind of comes up and then it deflects a little bit left, or more left than it would normally, which is a la Sandy, sort of, in a kind of a way. But in other words, high pressure blocks it to the north, so it gets deflected somewhat to the west until that high pressure moves on. So it actually kind of stalls in some fashion in the vicinity of Long Island or southeast New England or something like that on a number of the models. So, we'll just see what the Hurricane Center says. In the 11 o'clock discussion, they pointed out that there is this trend in the models and that they're going to have to keep moving the cone to the west, which is what they've done. But they're not, they won't jump on it all at once, I don't think. I think they'll just nudge it farther to the west if the model trends continue. But by tomorrow, two things are going to happen tomorrow. One is that because it's so close to the time that this would happen, probably Sunday would be the time that it would be beginning there. It's getting close because you have so many people in place, so many people that have to get out on 2-lane roads and, ferries and all kind of things that it takes to get off of the coastlines in that part of the United States. You have that going on. The second thing, though, that's going to happen tomorrow is that NOAA will deploy all their resources. They have the jet going out to measure the strength of the high pressure system, to be sure that the more precise measurements are put into the models. And I think we're going to get that by tomorrow morning. So when the model, when they're using the models tomorrow, I think they'll have that. So, if once they do all that, the trend really is to aim some sort of hurricane in a threatening way at coastal New York, New England, something like that. They've just got to get people moving. You just have to, because there's just not enough time to really organize for this kind of event. It just doesn't happen very often to have a super strong storm there in the summertime.
Yeah, sounds like an emergency management, nightmare trying to make that call and get people out safely in time. But I'm just thinking if the Cat 1 were heading towards South Florida, people they would take precautions, get out of some of the most vulnerable areas and we'd be just fine. What would we be seeing impacts wise out of something if it did trek into New England later on this weekend? What would you expect? I know that the surge from the coastline is drastically different there than it would be here.
Well, you have the effect of the tide is so different there than it is here. I mean, the tide can go up and down 5 or 6 feet. So if something comes at, the peak of the surge comes at low tide compared to high tide, that's a dramatic difference in whether the storm has any kind of surge type effect or not. That's the first thing. The second thing is, though, that if the storm stalls where it's actually there for more than one tide cycle, then you have, because you have different areas that are affected by different cycles of the tide. I mean, for example, in Hurricane Sandy, everybody knows that it hit New York. Well, and everybody knows that it hit lower Manhattan. The power was knocked out, the subways were knocked out, and all that in lower Manhattan. Well, it didn't drastically affect the northern end of Manhattan where the sewage plants are and LaGuardia Airport is and the food distribution for the city is, because it was low tide there while it was high tide in the southern end of Manhattan. So it's really complicated in terms of the timing of when the worst of the wind pushing the water into these waterways and so forth, compared to when the tides come in. So what you have in around Long Island, you have Long Island Sound, for example. Long Island Sound goes east-west north of Long Island. So if you get a storm to the south that's pushing ocean water into the Sound, it has to go somewhere in that Sound, right? It's trapped in this big, long, narrow body of water. Well, where does it go? It goes up into the rivers and harbors and everything else that's all along Long Island Sound in Connecticut and Rhode Island and New York and all the way to New York City. LaGuardia Airport sits right there on Long Island Sound. So you have just a tremendous amount of infrastructure and people and complicated coastline and difficult problems to navigate in terms of forecasting, in terms of alerting, in terms of moving people from beach areas. I mean, it's daunting to imagine if a really strong hurricane comes up where it's pushing water into those waterways and onto those beaches and so forth, and kind of stalls or moves very slowly. It's really difficult to imagine all the scenarios because there's so much going on there. It's so densely populated and it's a very complex coastline. It's we think of ours as being sort of complicated, but because we have these rivers, what happens in the intracoastal and what happens in Biscayne Bay and all that, that's super simple compared to the northeastern coastline and dealing with the tide cycles in different places being so different and all the complications that go with trying to make a forecast in that situation. Crazy.
Well, this weekend is the time, right? Saturday
Sunday-ish,
into Sunday?
Yeah, Sunday into Monday, depending on how, Sunday it gets near Long Island, and then depending on what the model is saying, is it stalling near Long Island before it goes up and affects New England or what? So anyway, it's going to be a lot of difficult calls by the National Hurricane Center because putting a hurricane into that part of the United States is always complex on a summer weekend. It's it's a whole different level. Once you get to September, get to Labor Day, and then kids are going back to school. People are back where they normally live. They're not at some little coastal bungalow somewhere, right? So, but once
Carrie Emanuel
like the Great November or the Great New England Hurricane or the Long Island Express, it was called, 1938. That happened in September. That happened September 18th or 19th. So there weren't a whole lot of people at the coast. A lot of people had left the coastal sections by that time and gone back to New York City or wherever they live. So it was different at the coast by that time of the year. But this is August, so this is a more daunting situation for sure.
Yeah, Carrie Emanuel, we had on the podcast earlier this year. He's got a great part in his book called Divine Wind on that storm, and he talks just about that, how if it had happened earlier, in 1938, how much worse it would have been. So
Yeah.
we're in
Crazy.
August, different story.
All right. So, all right, Luke, I'm turning the podcast over to you.
All right, everybody. So here's part one on my talk with Bryan about the years before Hurricane Andrew and that life-changing event. All right, everyone. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and that is speak with Bryan himself. He's an exceptional meteorologist, an incredible communicator, and an almost unreal database of hurricane knowledge in his mind. So, Bryan, you've had a long and it's a truly fascinating career. What people don't know is you and I talk before and after the podcast almost every time about the stories that you have. So he's authored 2 books, My Hurricane Andrew Story and Hurricane Almanac, The Essential Guide to Storms Past, Present, and Future. He's, of course, the resident hurricane specialist at WPLG, where we work together. And he's also worked for the Weather Channel, CNN, CBS Network, and, of course, was a chief meteorologist in Miami, walking South Florida through the infamous hurricane of 1992, Andrew, which we will talk a lot about on this podcast, right? Quite the resume. Bryan, I have a tremendously deep respect for you, and I'm sure many of those of you that are listening do as well. So today, we will discuss your life and the big moments in it. So
All right,
welcome
Luke.
to your podcast.
Okay, thank you, I guess.
Yeah. So let's start from the very top. You know, we all have a story of how we became interested in weather. What's yours? And was it always hurricanes?
No, it was not always hurricanes, and it wasn't even weather when I was a kid. I mean, not that I wasn't amused by hurricanes. I grew up on the Central Florida East Coast, and, you know, I was kind of thrilled when Hurricane Cleo came along and Hurricane Betsy came along in 1965. Cleo was in 64. And my oldest memory from being a little kid was Hurricane Hazel in 1954. I was 3 years old, and my father was out of town. I was just there with my mother in New Jersey, and the power went out, and the wind was blowing outside. I thought it was great. My mother was just, you know, a wreck. But, you know, where is Joe? She would say, you know, he was out on a business trip. But so I had these moments, and then Donna in 1960 and the Jersey Shore and all that. I had these moments with hurricanes, and I liked them, but that wasn't my thing. My thing when I was in what we called junior high back then and high school was science, math, and broadcasting. I loved radio. I would sit in my room with my transistor radio, tuning to the distant stations from Chicago and New York and Fort Wayne and Little Rock, and I could tell you what frequency and what station was on what frequency, and that's what I listened to every night. And I was very amused and interested that every station could play the same music, but some stations sounded better than others. And that kind of idea has lived with me to this day, that it's not just about the content. It's how you package the content that makes a difference in how people perceive the content, right? It's a very fundamental thing. And I learned that in radio, and it's so true in television today. Every TV station can more or less cover the same news, but some stations it just clicks better. The people click better. It just kind of comes together better, right? I mean, you see this everywhere. So anyway, that was what I was really interested in when I was a kid. It wasn't until I was at WPLG in the 1980s doing a program called Neighborhood Weather at 5:30 every afternoon, where I had to produce a segment outside somewhere in South Florida and make it interesting. And I spent a lot of time at the Historical Museum in downtown Miami researching stories. And I figured out in doing that you can't really talk about the history of Miami without talking about hurricanes. And it occurred to me, gee, if I'm ever chief meteorologist somewhere and a hurricane like used to happen all the time started happening again, I better know something about hurricanes. So that's what really set me on the path to studying hurricanes and, you know, getting prepared just in case something could happen if indeed we did have a hurricane in those years before Andrew. And, and that really led to the Hurricane Andrew coverage. And then after that, of course, I became kind of all about hurricanes.
All right. So let's talk about that for a second. you had an awakening with that, right? Because South Florida, for a long time, was not dealing with hurricanes, and you dove into the history books and found, right? Didn't that kind of change how you felt
Absolutely. I mean, you cannot really study the 20th century history of South Florida without studying hurricanes. I mean, just downtown Miami, in the first 7 decades of the 20th century, the eye of a hurricane came over downtown 7 times. I mean, this was like hurricane central through those many decades. That doesn't count the Category 4 in Fort Lauderdale and another one that hit south of downtown Miami in 1945, and the Fort Lauderdale one was in 47. And there were 2 hurricanes in 47, and there were 2 in 48. And it was a Category 4 in 59, and a Category 4 that came over downtown in 1950. So, you know, it was just hurricanes on top of hurricanes back then. So even though people think, you know, we've had a lot of hurricanes recently, and it does kind of feel like it, but it was nothing. It has been nothing like it was back during that time. And in the 20s, we had the Great Miami Hurricane in 1926. But that was followed by a monster, and there were 3 in 1926, by the way. 3 threats in 26, counting the big one. And in 1928, there was this giant hurricane that was coming towards South Florida, ended up hitting in the Palm Beaches. And then in 29, there was another one, another big hurricane that stayed just offshore. So it was a different time back then in terms of hurricane threats than this seemingly very busy time we have today.
So we'll circle back to how you go from the beginning of your career into meteorologist, because there's obviously a jump that happened there. And I've got a question for you that in a bit. But first, I want to learn more about you and what makes you tick, because you have what I call a motor. You've got this drive. You know, a lot of people, the majority of people, they do what gets them the paycheck, and then they kind of stop. And it's easy to see why, you know, because you've got a family, you have, you know, vacations to plan, you've got chores to do around the house, you go to work, you do your job, and then you're done and you're off to another aspect of your life. And that's okay. That's fine. I'm not pointing, you know, any fingers at that. But you're not like that. I mean, from public speaking to this podcast to just so many things that you do that are outside of what gets you a paycheck, you have this motor that's always running, and you fill your days with work that's centered around hurricanes. And when there's a storm around, you're relentless. I mean, I know people see you on TV, but folks, that's a small portion of it. He's preparing and he's writing, and there's just a lot. So my question to you is, where does this come from? Is this a work ethic that you've developed, or is this just the way you've always been?
Well, it's a combination of things, I think. First of all, when I went to the university, I had to put myself through school, and back then you couldn't borrow the money in the way that you can now. You couldn't get student loans, weren't kind of a regular thing. And so I had to work. So I worked like crazy to go to school and work, and you know, I had 3 jobs a lot of the time there. One of the times, by the way, I had a radio job that was midnight to 6 a.m. Monday through Friday, and 6 to midnight on Saturday. And then I was going to, you know, school full time. Plus, I had a job in the afternoon for a few hours as well. So I would sleep in 3 shifts. So it was pretty intense. But anyway, so I guess I learned, you know, to do what was necessary back then. But now, you know, now I'm old, so you know, kids are grown, and so I kind of feel like I do what needs to be done, and when there's things that need to be done and could be done better, then I'll spend the time to do them. I mean, it does indeed never stop. That's for sure.
Well, that's the other thing about you, is you seem to have this awareness of this could be better, even if something works fine. It might work just fine. You see this. We can improve this. It's your critical thinking. Is that something else that you've developed after, you know, just years of being in the business, or is that kind of also who you are, is just being aware and trying to make things improve?
I think that's a bit of who I am, because I have always tended to look at a problem or look at a situation and say, all right, if we don't do it this way, how would we do it? and then evaluate if that new way is better, because new is not always better. One of the things I've learned, when I was young, I kind of thought that my new way was always going to be better. But what I learned was that the old way is sometimes really better. And so I try and now more objectively evaluate whether the new idea is indeed the better idea. But I do still like to think about things that way and evaluate whether the way, this came into play, in a big way with hurricanes, for example, with the cone, right? When I was tasked in the early 90s with coming up with new ways to do the weather, one of the things that was not at the top of the list, there were other things on the list, like just daily weather, new ways to do the daily weather. But when it came to think about hurricanes, I started thinking about, well, I'm, using dots or whatever I was using. And generally, by the way, what we talked about more was a hurricane warning area back then. We didn't plot the dots. I never really plotted the dots on the map in terms of where the Hurricane Center forecast points were. We talked about the hurricane warning area, but hurricane warning area could extend from the Keys to Central Florida. That wasn't. Not to
mention be short-lived.
Yeah.
What happens several days
before,
a day before the hurricane warning.
Right.
You need to raise awareness.
Right. Exactly. So, I came up with the idea of the cone, and that we needed something like that, and then set out to work with a guy who was the guy who created the first hurricane models at the National Hurricane Center, a guy named Charlie Newman, helped me out with figuring out how big the width of the cone should be based on errors back then. And, and that actually premiered with Hurricane Andrew. And then in 1996, when the graphic software caught up to where we could actually fill it in and make like an ice cream cone like today. That's when we started with the ice cream cone. So, but that was, that came out of thinking about, isn't there a better way to communicate, like some sort of graphical way to communicate what we were saying verbally? Because we never said it's going there. And nobody believed that we could even forecast the hurricanes 3 days out, let alone 5 days out, right? There wasn't just a general thought in the world that we would do that. So it wasn't hard to tell people that the forecast is uncertain. Everybody knew that. But I wanted something more tangible, and that's where the idea of the cone came from.
So was that was your idea? Nobody else had done that? I know that you were the first one to put it on television, but was there something behind the scenes at the Hurricane Center that led you to that, or did you develop this independently?
Well, no, interestingly, I developed it independently, and then I went to Charlie Newman, who had retired by that time, and he lived in South Miami, and I went down to his house, and he had these computers. He had a huge computer set up like I had never seen before. I remember all the monitors. He must have had 5 of them across there. They were all, tubes back then, cathode ray tubes, but they were all green. So it was like black. That was not black and white. They were green and white. And I thought, wow, this is like space age down here. And he brought up these ellipses that he had calculated, and he had different calculations of error ellipses for 24, 48, and 72-hour forecasts, different ones for different basins. So like for storms that were moving east to west in the deep tropics, he had certain error ellipses. And for storms that were curving north, he had certain error ellipses. I think he had 3 different sets of error ellipses, if I remember right. And they were all ellipses indicating that timing was more difficult than the track. They got the track better than the timing, right? So it was more of an ellipse. So he showed me that. And as far as I knew at that time, this was something he had on his computer. Well, and then I took those measurements, and I said, how many miles is that, and how many miles is that? And I could just kind of averaged all those together and came up with a number for how wide my cone sort of internal line was going to be at 24, 48, and 72 hours. Well, unbeknownst to me, those ellipses were actually sent around on a fax inside the government, mostly in emergency management. And I found out I found that later. And Charlie actually had created those ellipses back in a paper, I think in 1979 for the first time. But anyway, I didn't know about that because it was being faxed around. There was no, internet to actually know it. And then I found out even after that the Japanese had done something like a cone going back to the 50s. So, they had this kind of V-shaped thing, and then they modified it a few times over the years. But again, without the internet, there was really no way to know that. So it was, sort of a thing where, different people were thinking about the problem and coming up with a similar answer for how to communicate track error.
So how did you, let's say you're on television and there's a storm out there, how do you know it's a threat, or if there's no cone and you have to wait for warnings to go up? I assume watches would go up first and then the warnings, but did you raise awareness before there were watches issued any way, or was it just wait until the watch gets issued and then we'll discuss it?
Oh, no, we talked about it. I mean, we had satellites. Satellites came along in the 70s where you could actually see kind of in real time where the storms were. So, we talked about it every night on TV, what the status of it was, and we showed water vapor. For Hurricane Andrew, I showed water vapor. I showed this big upper-level low to the north that was shearing it, and in theory was going to deflect it to the north, maybe. Everything was there on a cruder version than we have now. We didn't have any models. There was no such thing as spaghetti models in the early 90s during Hurricane Andrew, except the National Hurricane Center, and they barely used them because they came in at all weird times, and very few of them came in the forecast cycle. So, for example, for the 5 o'clock in the afternoon advisory, you only had a few models, and the AVN, today's GFS, the GFS is the successor to the AVN, that didn't come in until like 7:30 at night. And then the other kind of good model came in after that, and that was based on morning data. So in model parlance, that was the 12Z model that came out at 7:30 and 9 o'clock at night, because they all ran in order on the supercomputer, the so-called supercomputer of the time. So, and besides that, the AVN's spaghetti model had never been run before. So it was an experimental mode. So back then, because things weren't distributed on the internet to everybody, they would just, when they were ready to experiment with it, they'd just run it, send it to the Hurricane Center, and the first time that tracker, it was called, that tracked the center of the vortex, ran and was actually distributed, was for Hurricane Andrew for 1992.
A lot of firsts for Andrew. The cone that you had developed was ready to go just in time. This AVN model just in time. It's interesting that nobody believed the AVN. So it was not incorporated in their forecast until the AVN sort of over time became the one that seemed to be right. The storm wasn't turning north. In fact, it turned a little bit south. And the AVN had it in Cuba, had it through the Keys, had it way in the Gulf, had it too fast, but it had it westerly, not, curving up and offshore. So everybody started paying a little more attention to it. I mean, not me. I couldn't see it. The only way I knew about what the models were saying was I would call the National Hurricane Center on the phone. And I'd say, hey, what's new today? That was the only way I knew. Otherwise, all we had really, for my forecasting for South Florida at that time, is I had a 500 millibar chart. In other words, the middle levels of the atmosphere. What was that going to look like? Where were the highs and lows going to be? And we got a chart that the National Weather Service drew that we could look at, but not very far in advance. So the only sort of far in advance thing was this chart about the mid-levels of the atmosphere and, sort of where the steering currents were going to be for hurricanes or for daily weather, matter of fact. Wow. So we'll circle back to that in a second, but on this thread of the cone kind of ties me into a question about, your philosophy about hurricanes and just messaging in general. It seems like you place as much or maybe more emphasis or energy on communication and the messaging as you do on maybe the weather itself. Like, I don't know if I'm phrasing that right, but my point is you put a lot of emphasis on that. Did you always do this, or did it come from seeing a disconnect between viewers and what you were trying to say? Because I feel that sometimes I'll say whatever it is that maybe it's right, but it's difficult to follow. Like probability of precipitation, 50% rain chance. What does that mean? Maybe it makes sense to me, but if it doesn't make sense to the viewer, then it's not perceived and it's useless. So how did you do that, and how did you sharpen that skill?
Well, yes, I've always been that way, and I think it's because I didn't come from originally from a pure meteorological direction. Right? I was in broadcasting before I went back and got a master's and studied meteorology. So, I mean, I was in math and physics and all that as an undergraduate, but all that interim time, I produced news, I directed newscasts, directed television in general. I was also an engineer, and I ran a news department. So that was about, being the best at communicating the news and packaging the news. And through that time, I actually became a consultant of newscasts and so forth. So, a lot of that is about the sense of how it feels, how the communication of the newscast feels. Does the newscast feel, I use the terms, does it feel discordant? Like a discordant sound is a little bit off. It doesn't feel like a major chord. I said, I want this thing to feel like you're playing, a G or a C, like something that feels good to people, and all about the feeling. So when I was producing the news in Denver, I did a lot of things about making it feel good to watch it, and it turned out to be very successful. That's why the company moved me to Louisville to run the news department there. And through that process, I learned that how the communication feels has a lot to do with how well it's understood. And so if you have a confusion factor, that just is kind of discordant. It kind of makes you feel a little off, diverts your mind to try and figure out the confusion. And so minimizing confusion, keeping it clear and simple. The mantra I came up with in 1996 is the precision is the enemy of accuracy, right? If you get down in the weeds, very often you lose the story thread. And what you want to do is take people through the story to get them to the conclusion of understanding what we know. So what do we know, what don't we know, and when are we going to know more, right? If that's what they kind of go away with and feel good about, then chances are they're going to come back and watch again, and they're going to just feel better about being part of the process and not having a lot of questions about minutia that is not relevant to the overall, what is the threat and what do we need to do about it?
That makes a lot of sense. And, coming from a field that wasn't in meteorology to start with has probably served you really well. So I want to go back and visit that a little bit. You started in radio way back in the day, right? And then you became, you worked all sides of television. You were an engineer, news director, and you mentioned Kentucky. Now, in Kentucky, there's a wild story of while you're not a meteorologist, you're a news director, and a snowstorm hits. Tell us about that, and was that the event that got you to go get your degree in meteorology?
It was not quite that event, but it was that situation. So what happened was I was working in Denver. I was producing the news in Denver, and the company offered me this job in Louisville to go to their station there and run the news department. And I took the job. And so I had to go get an apartment. And I was just going to go move there, get an apartment, and that was going to be it. But the Denver Broncos were going to play in the Super Bowl. And so the Denver station needed me to stay in Denver to produce the Super Bowl coverage. The anchors were going to go to Dallas for the game and so forth and so on. So they needed somebody, you know, behind the scenes to put together that coverage while other people were just doing the regular newscast. So what I had to do was go to Louisville to go get an apartment, come back to Denver to produce the Super Bowl, and then I would go be news director in Louisville. So I fly to Louisville, and I get there and go out and looked for apartments and found one that was a possibility. And that night, I'm in the motel down the street from the TV station, and there was snow in the forecast, but nobody was, you know, crazy about it or anything. And at 5:30 in the morning, my phone rings, and it's the assignment editor. He's the guy that works in the news department that directs where the reporters go and so forth. And I knew him from Denver because he had worked there, and he had come with the previous news director to Louisville. And he said, Bryan, I don't know if you looked outside yet. And it's 5:30. I'm still sleeping here. But it's incredible out there. It's snowed in. I'm not going to be able to get there. I can't get out of my neighborhood. Maybe you can get down to the TV station so that somebody's there. And I was only, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of a mile at a motel down the street. And so I got in this car that they had given me, which was this giant Ford LTD, land yacht thing, and I plowed my way down the street and got to the TV station and kind of dumped the car off the side of the road because I couldn't get up the driveway, and went around the back, and I'm banging on the back door of the TV station because there were 2 engineers in there, it turns out. And they come out and they go, you know, hello, who are you? And I say, I'm the new news director, and the assignment editor sent me and told me to come, and they said, okay, come on in. And so I went in. I went into the news department, which was totally black, dark, and found the switches, the light switches. I'd only been in there once for the job interview, walked through, and figured out how to turn on the monitors and turn on the teletypes and kind of bring the place alive. And I'm kind of ripping back then we had these printers, and you'd rip off the news, and I'm looking at it, and I'm turning on the TV, and I'm looking at, you know, there were 3 network stations at that time, and I'm looking at it, and nobody is covering the snowstorm. It's all like regular programming. And back then there was no morning news, by the way. There wasn't, you know, you had cut-ins inside of Good Morning America. We were ABC, so we had these cut-ins at 7:25, 7:55, 8:25, 8:55. But there was no 6 a.m., 5 a.m., 4:30 a.m. news at that time. Anyway, so I'm looking at the clock, and I'm looking at, you know, nobody's covering this, and then it's getting to be later and later, and I go to the engineers, and I go, doesn't somebody come in here in the morning to, like, do the news? And they said, yeah, she should be here by now. Maybe it's the snow or something. And so it got to be like 7:15, and we're supposed to be on at 7:25. And so I go to the engineers and say, if we aim the camera at the anchor desk there, can you put me on TV? And they said, yeah, I think we can, the 2 of us can do that. And so we did that, and I went over to the assignment desk, and I found the kind of Rolodex of where the phone numbers were for the staff. And I had met 2 of the anchor people on my interview trip, and one of them, his name was Dan Lewis. He became famous in Seattle as the lead anchor on Como TV in Seattle later on, but he was the weekend anchor. And I found his name and his number, and I call him on the phone, and I say, hey, Dan, it's Bryan. Remember me? I'm the new news director. I'm going to go on TV here in just a minute, and I'm going to put you on if I can, and you can tell me what's going on where you are. Where are you? Oh, you're in Hurstbourne? It's called Hurstbourne? I had no idea. You know, I'd never really been to Louisville before. And so the 7:25, I went on, and Dan Lewis is in Hurstbourne. Let's go to him. Dan, what are you seeing outside your window now? And he did a little thing, and I'm just reading off the wire copy, and, you know, throw it back to the network. But then I go back on like 10 minutes later, and then finally the anchor came in, and other people made it in by 8 o'clock or so. I co-anchored at 8 o'clock, and then I just turned it over to the whole crew that was there, and then, you know, produced the coverage after that. And we actually ended up doing very, very well. We actually, the newspaper said WLKY leads in storm coverage. It was pretty terrific. And I have another part to that morning, by the way. So back then, each TV station had one remote truck, only one. And so I said, we got to get this remote truck downtown to the mayor's office. I want the mayor on TV here because I want to understand what in the world is going on with the city and why are the streets not being plowed? What's happening here? Like nothing was happening. There were no plows anywhere in the city, and they said, okay, you sure you want the mayor? Yeah, yes, I want the mayor. I want to I want to talk to him right now. And so we had all of us out there. We must have had 10, 15 people on that remote truck to push it out to keep it from falling over, to get out the driveway to get downtown. They got downtown, and they keep saying to me, you sure you want to set up at the mayor's office? And I said, yes, I want to talk to the mayor. And so they're okay, new news director, whatever you want. So they're setting up in the mayor's office, and the assignment editor has gotten in by then, and he says, the county judge is on the phone, and he'd like to talk to you. And I go, okay, for a minute, because it was very busy. And so I picked up the phone and I said, good morning, Judge, what can I do for you? And he goes, I insist that you bring the camera to my office. And I'm like, he wants to bring the camera to his office. And the assignment editor says, yeah, it's at the other end of the hall. I said, Judge, if you want to come to our camera, I'm more than happy to put you on if you've got something to add to this situation. But the camera is where the camera is. And we're going to go on TV here in just a moment. And, and he was kind of complaining. I said, Judge, I'd really like to talk to you, but I really can't. I have to go. And I hang up. And the assignment editor has this kind of white face on, like, oh my God, right? And that was County Judge Mitch McConnell was the guy that the county judge in Kentucky parlance is sort of like the mayor of Miami-Dade County. He's the administrative head of the county, like in Texas. It's the same system in Texas. It's the county judge. And he was, of course, a big Republican. The mayor was a big Democrat. William Stansbury was his name. They hated each other. And so the idea that either one of them was going to go down to the other one's office to be on TV was a completely foreign idea. And but he did. He went down to the office because we only had one camera, because we only had one remote truck, and there was nothing else to do about it. But anyway, it was an interesting time.
To say the least. That's quite a tale you tell there, Bryan. Golly, you run into Mitch McConnell on day one in a snowstorm in a new town.
Yeah, and not knowing much about the town, having any idea even what a county judge was at that moment.
Okay, so at some point we jump over into meteorology. When does this happen?
Okay, so about a year later, my weathercaster, a lady named Angie Humphreys, was a terrific communicator and a wonderful personality. I mean, she was really a star in Louisville. And she decided that she wanted to leave and pursue a career in country music. Well, the other two stations, main stations, ABC and NBC stations, had meteorologists for their weather people. And I decided we needed a meteorologist. So I went out looking for meteorologists. And I kept offering more and more and more money to find somebody that could be the meteorologist, and I wasn't making a whole lot of progress. And I'm thinking, and I keep selling them on how easy a job it's going to be and how much support they're going to have, and we're going to have radio for them to do as well to augment their income and all these things that I like to do. And I thought, you know what? Meteorology on TV is the confluence of science and broadcasting, which is really what I'm all about. Anyway, maybe I should do that before I turn 30 and see if I can do it. So I went down to Tallahassee to Florida State, where I'd gotten my undergraduate degree. And they had a thing then that was, if you go to graduate school within 7 years of your undergraduate degree, you don't have to take the GRE. which is the exam that you take to get into graduate school, right? And so I thought that was appealing. And I was at 6.5 years at that point. And so I thought, okay, let me see if I can put this together. So I went to the meteorology school, and the old team was there. I mean, the people that started that school in the early 50s. And it was, Florida State at that time was the meteorology school of the South. Like Penn State was of the Northeast, Wisconsin, the upper Midwest. There were other very good meteorology schools around, but Mississippi State wasn't, doing that then. And really, it was the meteorology school of the South. So it was the right place to go. And so I talked to the meteorologist, and there was a big fight in the meteorology department between the purists that wanted to stay with the solve the equations kind of meteorology.
Sure.
And the people that thought, no, we need to expand because broadcast meteorology is becoming a bigger thing, and we need to broaden our program. So I happened to come across Dr. Tom Gleason, who was this very kind of feisty guy, great old guy, been there since the beginning in the early 50s. And he made a deal with the dean of the communications school to create the first broadcast meteorology kind of quasi program. It was a test program for one person, for me. And the deal was that as part of, instead of kind of doing elective stuff, I did meteorology research or broadcast meteorology research. So I ended up teaching 2 classes while I was doing this in order to get in-state tuition, and 2 communications classes. And so I'd have my students make calls, and I had a scheme for making calls and so forth to ask viewers, did you watch Channel 6 or Channel 27 last night? Do you remember the weathercast? What do you remember? And really trying to be granular about the details of what they saw. And I got the job doing the evening weather on Channel 27 at the same time. So they were either watching me or the guy on Channel 6. Anyway, so I put together this big research project about that, and that became the communications part of this broadcast meteorology masters that the meteorology department and the communications department put together as sort of a test case.
I'd never heard that. I didn't know that you were partially responsible for bringing in a whole new program to a university.
Well, yeah, that? And they knew there was a contingent that knew they needed to do it, right? But even once I was there, there was a battle within the meteorology department because it was a hardcore meteorology school. When the class in dynamics, which anybody that studied meteorology remembers dynamics very well, right? It's a lot of equations, right? They gave us the final on the very first day of class, and that was derive the vorticity equation and describe your steps, right? And the vorticity equation is, partial differential equation in, I don't know, is it 17 terms or 14 terms? I don't remember. It's a long ass equation, and anyway, so that was what they were all about. It was all about which turned out great meteorologists. I mean, most of the meteorologists in the world that were chief meteorologists or ran meteorology departments in countries all over the world were FSU graduates back in the 90s. I think lots and lots and lots of famous names that came out of FSU. Because they were the school of the South at that time.
Yeah, I can relate with that feeling, though, of hardcore meteorology. There was an odd sense of pride that people seem to have within. I went to Oklahoma, and I remember whenever I was taking the tour of the school, to become an undergrad, a grad student had given me the tour, and he was almost bragging about the dropout rate. Not like, hey, just so you know, it was a source of pride. Oh, we made it. And, going through Oklahoma, there wasn't even much forecasting, what we call operational meteorology. A lot of it was the derivations and just the theory behind it all. And, those people by those people, I mean the research meteorologists, those that are geared toward going on to higher education, getting, masters and doctorates. they take that stuff very seriously, where some of the others were more interested in the big scale. How do I apply this and how do we talk about it?
Yeah, I had just one class. I had one forecasting class. It was one credit. It was graduate students and undergraduates together in the forecasting lab. And that's where I made my forecasts every day and then drove out to the TV station and put them on the map, magnetic map back then, and to do the 5:30 news because we didn't have any maps, anything but a teletype at the TV station. That was it. It was a little ABC station, Tallahassee, at the time. And so it was because of that forecasting class, I learned the tricks of forecasting with, very little information. The crude models that we had, the LFM and the LFM, I guess. I don't really remember any other model, but a lot of it was, looking at the current weather pattern and kind of understanding how that was likely to evolve.
I can't imagine. We're spoiled after having all since I've been forecasting, we've had all the easy stuff where the models, they spit something out, might be right, might not, but you've got something to talk about. Back then you really had to, you had to know your stuff, I guess, if all that you had was a mid-level, chart to look at. But so, okay, now you've got your meteorology degree, you've done weather on TV, and you build a big career out of this. Now, obviously we know about South Florida, but you have been in some other really high-profile roles. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I graduated in June of 1980 from graduate school. And, I kind of was hunting around a little bit. But CNN was just starting. They started in June of 1980. So I graduated in May, and they were starting in June. So I went up to the station that I had originally worked as an engineer in Atlanta and got them to let me use the green screen to make a demo. And I took it over to CNN. Sam Zellman was his name. He was in charge of hiring at CNN, and they hired me to do the weekends. So I was the first weekend meteorologist on CNN, which we called Chicken Noodle News in 1980, which was really quite an experience. And then I was doing news consulting and engineering and producing consulting during the week. So I'd go to Atlanta Saturday and Sunday, and then sometimes go back to Tallahassee and work on a report or something like that, or sometimes go off to Denver or some other place to do my consulting because they hired me to put together the engineering to cover by remote the political conventions in 1980. And I think it was Dallas, or was it San Francisco and New York? Anyway, it was two different big cities where the political conventions were, Democratic and Republican convention, and they wanted to send an anchor to the convention and anchor part of the coverage from the convention. And then I put together a little group of TV stations to defray the costs and build a switching system and worked with the engineers to make that coverage work. So that was what I did, during the week while I was doing CNN on the weekend. And then I went to my first AMS conference in 1980, which that year seems to me was in August. Could it have been in August of that year? It was in Denver anyway. And happened to be sitting there next to a very boisterous, dynamic, kind of crazy guy named Pete Gibbons, who everybody knew back then, who was the chief meteorologist at KGO in San Francisco. It was the #1 station in San Francisco. It was one of these big ABC O&O stations along with WABC in New York and KABC in Los Angeles. They were the dominant stations. Anyway, we got to talking, and he said, "You've got to come work for me in San Francisco." And I said, "San Francisco, huh? Okay." I'd been in San Francisco once in my life briefly, but okay. So anyway, I got hired in San Francisco that September and started working there, and that was quite an experience working for Pete and learning something about West Coast weather. I mean, nobody at Florida State in meteorology school ever mentioned a coastal eddy to me. The dynamics of the Humboldt current and all this stuff that you worry about on the West Coast and the the thickness of the marine layer and all of that you have to do to forecast the weather on the West Coast. I mean, I knew nothing. I knew zero. But Pete was great. He taught me the tricks. Like if the 576 line, you call it on the 500 millibar chart, was going to dip down, then we're going to put rain in the forecast or a chance of rain in the forecast. And you look at the thickness of the marine layer and you try and figure out is it going to be thicker or thinner tomorrow. And if it's going to be thinner, like lower, then it's not going to make it over the coastal mountains. So then the inland parts of the market will be warmer. It's a very dynamic market. I remember one day forecasting 57 for a high in the city and 107 in the eastern suburbs out in Concord, So we forecast for all around the bay, all the way from San Jose to the south, Santa Rosa to the north. And anyway, it was quite an experience learning how to forecast in the Bay Area.
So you go from there, but you've been, of course, South Florida. So
I hadn't been to South Florida yet. So that was that was my second weather job. So the first one was CNN, the second one was KGO, and in San Francisco. And then there was a management change at KGO, and they really, they were happy to have me stay, but they really wanted Lloyd Lindsay Young, who, if you don't know who Lloyd is and what Lloyd did, you need to Google Lloyd Lindsay Young weather, because he became quite famous in New York, and he was just one of the nicest men in broadcasting, but he had this huge personality, and he would like put a 500 millibar chart, upper air chart on a map and aim a camera at it and say, "There's the 500 millibar chart, and it's a dandy, and let me show you why." And he would go over there and point with his finger and ding, and it was he was just great. Anyway, at the same time, that dynamic was happening in Atlanta. The president of Turner Broadcasting, who worked for Ted, knew of me through my news directing days and flew me to New York and offered me a job executive producing documentaries and magazines for Turner Broadcasting. And I thought, well, should I do that? He said, "Oh, no, it's just really, there's just one show I really need you to get off the ground. It's Ted's baby. It's called Portrait of America. I really need that thing produced." So I went back to that same Atlanta station where I had been an engineer and asked them if they needed weather help, and they needed a weekend weather guy. So I went to Atlanta and did executive producer for Ted Turner during the week and weather at WXIA on the weekend. And after about 3 months or so, the Turner job turned into from one show to 7 shows. And I was executive producing a new show in New York and another one in Los Angeles. And I was doing these breakfast in Atlanta, lunch in New York, dinner in LA days, twice a week. And it was too much to do the weekend weather in Atlanta as well. So I quit doing the weather for about 5 or 6 months in there. So it was.
I can see why.
Yeah. So it was pretty intense there for a while. But it was a great experience. I was there for Snow Jam 1982 in Atlanta, which was one of these, which I had forecast. I was doing the weekends, and I forecast 8 below for a low temperature on that Sunday, and everybody was like freaking out. What? And it got to 8 below. Somehow I did. I don't know how I did that, based on what I knew. It had to have been a guess. And then I forecast snow on Tuesday, precip on Wednesday, and precip ends on Thursday, and it ended up being snow, ice, snow. So it was a crazy time there in that forecasting winter weather in Atlanta, as you can imagine.
I wouldn't want to forecast that anytime, let alone today in Atlanta, which is horrendously sensitive to winter type weather. You had to do that way back then with a 500 millibar chart, so you got to the mid levels. And gutsy. So,
we had moss. So for meteorologists, we had moss back then, right? And you got used to kind of the moss was never cold enough, it was too hot. It was, you got used to that. Moss was like the models forecast, and there was a statistical process in this MOS output, a statistical process of coming up with what the highs and lows and precip would be for each day. But I mean, the MOS, I don't remember what the MOS predicted, but it didn't predict it right. But you kind of look at the weather map and say, well, it looks like it's going to be colder than that based on whatever the factors were.
Well, that and moss does well whenever there's nothing really to disturb it. It doesn't do well if there's a strong front coming through, for instance. So
it doesn't do well when something is extreme. It doesn't do well because it smooths it out because it averages back toward normal, toward average. So it kind of smooths out the extremes that the model might put out.
Okay, so we're going to get to Andrew in just one second, but right before we do, and your time in South Florida, it almost came to an end, and you were set to leave. I remember reading this in your book. You were about to leave South Florida right around the time that Andrew shows up. Is that right?
Yes. So I was chief meteorologist, given the job. So I was at WPLG in the 80s doing neighborhood weather. It was a great gig. It was really a great gig. It was so much fun. And it was a different place back then because the TV station was on Biscayne Boulevard, just north of the Julia Tuttle Causeway. And I would go do the weather in the afternoon in Coral Springs or Homestead, and I would drive. And I'd leave the TV station at 3 o'clock, and I'd get there for the 5:30 weather with plenty of time to spare. I mean, because the traffic was not insane. It was bad at rush hour, but it wasn't insane like it is now. It was just a different kind of place, just not quite as dynamic and crowded and crazy. So in any case, one of the producers, star producers at WPLG, was hired as news director for the NBC station, and she hired me to be chief meteorologist. And so we all sat around saying, what should we do to make your weather different? And I said, I think we should do hurricanes. Because nobody is doing hurricanes. Nobody's really paying attention to hurricanes. And the hurricane history is so rich. There are so many stories to tell. Remember, I just spent nearly 6 years telling stories, a lot of them about weather and hurricanes and history and stuff like that. So I said, there's so many stories to tell. And, we could just make a big deal out of it. Like we could build, instead of just a weather office, let's call it a storm center. And, let's sell the idea that we're going to be the hurricane station. And so they bought that. They bought into it. Not only did they buy into it from a marketing standpoint, they bought into it from a procedural standpoint, and they budgeted things. Say, all right, tell us what you need and tell us what we have to do, because I had the management and the engineering experience previously, right? And so for the 2.5 years before Andrew happened, we were all over town producing specials. I talked to emergency managers and the Hurricane Center people and the Coast Guard and the school board and the mayors and all people about their hurricane plans. So, I think that, I probably did, with the support of the TV station and a producer that they gave me to do all this, more kind of prep probably than anybody before or since in terms of talking to people in the community and understanding the plans of the various agencies and so forth. And I had a 3-year contract, and so, it was the middle of the third year, and I got word from the news director that the management in New York wanted changes at the TV station, and so the news director gave me a little over 6 months' notice that they were going to have to make a change, and so. And the reason was that the station was not doing great, and the people in New York thought, you got to make a change. You're never going to do better if you don't make a change. So, I was disappointed in that, but whatever. I wasn't, I was young enough to not worry too much about it. And my agent, I had an agent back then, started working on it. And anyway, she came up with a job in New York at the CBS station in New York, and I was going to do the very early morning network news. So back then, on ABC and NBC, or NBC and CBS at least, had a half hour of network news. And I guess CBS still does, called the early morning news. I think it was the CBS Early Morning News, and NBC had Sunrise, it was called. And so, and this at the time that I'm talking about this, aired at 5:30 a.m. And then local came on at 6, and then the network came back at 7 o'clock, just like now. But the local news started at 6. So they were going to hire me to do that early morning network news and the 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. local news on WCBS in New York. And then I would be the main fill-in guy on the network morning show, the CBS This Morning show. And so I went and I talked to him and back and forth, and it was all set. So I had the appointment to go finalize the deal, and I thought, okay, I'll look for an apartment and so forth while I'm there at 10 a.m. on August 24th, 1992, which ended up being the day that Andrew hit. So obviously I ended up, as it was happening, I ended up canceling the trip and so forth and so on. But they had my replacement. They were flying in a replacement to be there that day, as a matter of fact.
You have to look back at your life sometimes. And, do you hear yourself talk about how fate has stepped in? I mean, this is time number 3 where there have been some big things in your life that just happen they smack you in the face with their timing. It's just interesting to look at how your life has played out like that.
Yeah, so I think the thing is, yes, there's no question about it. I don't know anybody that's ever had success at what they're doing without having some luck. Absolutely. But I also, most people I know that are successful have set themselves up to be lucky.
Yeah, what's that saying? Success is where luck and preparation meet.
yeah, exactly. Like I think that's just a reality. Now, sometimes it's just luck, right? This situation was kind of pure luck, even though I honestly had gotten myself kind of geared up with the idea of going to New York. I was, sort of up for that. So I wasn't like totally disappointed and horrified with the idea of leaving. Now, after Andrew happened, I had opportunities to leave because my contract was still coming up at the end of that year, and I had opportunities to leave and do various things, and I couldn't do it. By that, after that, I was so attached to South Florida and the Hurricane Andrew thing every single day for 2 years. After that happened, my life was all about Hurricane Andrew. There was so much to do afterward that I wasn't going to leave South Florida then. Anyway.
So the Hurricane Andrew story really does start where you were just talking about the preparation, because it wasn't just something that was dreamt up in the promo department of we're the hurricane station. You made real effort and put in hard wires to make sure that you guys were ready if something came. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so there were a number of them. I think the most important one ended up being the connection with Y100 radio. And that didn't come into my brain until 91 or maybe early 92. I had talked to a variety of radio stations in South Florida, and I ended up, and I don't remember why I ended up at Y100, because there was a station, the station that today is Big 105.9. They had a backup transmitter hardened into the tallest building in downtown Fort Lauderdale. So their main transmitter was on the Dade-Broward line, on those towers along the Dade-Broward line, but they had this backup transmitter, and a famous disc jockey in South Florida named Rick Shaw was the general manager, or was the program director of the station, I guess, and the station was called Waxy 106. It was an oldies FM station. But anyway, Rick gave me a tour of the transmitter and was so proud of the fact that they had spent the money to harden this thing with gas lines going up to generators so that they could operate. And I don't remember why we ended up not having the connection with them, because we ended up with Y100. And the general manager with Y100 and I made a deal. And the deal was that they would take our audio if big hurricane threat came along, if we would pay the TV station would pay to run the wire up to their studio. And their studio sat at Sunrise Boulevard and US 1. So if you're going on Federal Highway and it turns to Sunrise Boulevard, then it turns back north. Right where it turned back north, that's where the Y100 studio was. So I had this discussion with the general manager and the program director and so forth. And so to finalize the deal, I went up to the studio. And I had been there before, but I don't know why it hit me this time. When I went up there, we made the deal. Okay, it's all set. You guys can install the wire. We'll connect it. Our engineers will work with you. And I walk out the door, and I look, and the intercoastal's right there. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. If the intercoastal is right there and we have a big hurricane, this whole place here is going to be underwater, and this is all going to be evacuated, and this radio station is not going to do us any good. So I went back and talked to the engineers and talked to them, and I said, let's do this. Let's run the wire to the Y100 transmitter and then run another wire to the studio. Connect those two wires together, because these were just telephone company wires that we were ordering from the phone company. And that's what they did. And then Hurricane Andrew is coming along, and they order an evacuation of that whole area. Y100 evacuates the studio, and their engineer goes out and takes that wire and connects it directly into the transmitter. And so we were on Y100, and that was one of the things that really saved the day, because people didn't have power, people didn't have television, and they had back then everybody had a what we called a transistor radio, a portable radio. Everybody had that, and people don't have that now, which is a terrible thing. The whole system isn't as robust now as it was then. But anyway, that turned out to be a great thing. And along with that, we had also put in a connection to the West Palm Beach radar. The National Weather Service back then had a Miami radar, which sat on the top of the National Hurricane Center across from the University of Miami, and West Palm Beach radar at the West Palm Beach Airport, which was paid for by the rich people in Palm Beach because they knew that their coverage was poor with the Miami radar. So that was the story anyway. So, but we had put a connection into the West Palm Beach radar, and then during the storm, when the Miami radar blew off the roof of the Hurricane Center, the weekend meteorologist, Bryan Allen, was in there dialing the phone. That one had to be dialed manually. Like you had to call the phone number of the radar, and it would answer, and you'd get the, the connection, and then the radar would start sweeping again. But at least we knew where the storm was after the Miami radar failed at 4:30 in the morning. So for that next 3 hours, we knew where the eye was as compared to the populated part of South Florida. We knew when the eye wall had moved past Homestead and past Kendall and into the Everglades.
That's still critical information.
Yeah.
I mean, you look back and it seems so obvious that there should be redundancies, but like I was saying earlier, a lot of people everything works. It works fine. And that's where you came in and really made a big difference there, that it was more than just being on TV. It's that you prepared for this big event, and you needed those things, and they saved the day. It's really incredible. That's how it worked out. And again, just in time. So let's talk about the forecast for Andrew, because this is something else that stands out and I'm not throwing anybody under the bus, but the forecast for Andrew was tough, and you had a little different message than some of the other outlets, if from what I've read is true. What data were you looking at that maybe others weren't, and what was your messaging that was maybe a little bit more raise the flag than some of the other outlets?
Well, yeah, so this is the difference between forecasting and risk communications, because the definition of risk is the odds of something happening times the consequences of it happening. Right? The odds can be very low, but if the consequences are super high, then the risk can be high. So on that Friday afternoon, now remember, we're talking about a storm that hit overnight Sunday night, Monday morning. So this is Friday, which seems like it's jam up on the time, but back then it wasn't so much, and Andrew was not cooperative in terms of long-term forecasting, because on Thursday, so 4 days before landfall, the hurricane hunters could not find a closed circulation. They found wind, but they didn't find a closed circulation. And so technically it should have been at that point downgraded to a tropical wave back then. Now, I don't know what they would do, whether they'd make it a potential tropical cyclone or what they would do in that circumstance. But anyway, Bob Sheets, who was the fantastic Hurricane Center director at the time, said, no, we're going to keep it because it's got the winds. And if it does wrap up, it's going to be a storm right away. So let's just not confuse anybody by taking Tropical Storm Andrew off the name. But that was 4 days before. So now 3 days before, it's a tropical storm, and it's the forecast is for it to go way north. I mean, like Central Florida or North Carolina or something, way north. And a curve, though. And it was coming in our general direction. And in the afternoon, the AVN map came in that showed a big high-pressure system, not just sitting over North Carolina, kind of where it had been, but building. So the intensity of the high, of the blocking high, was forecast to be bigger or stronger. And I thought, well, geez, if that happens, this storm is definitely not turning north, A. And B, it'll speed up because it'll have more flow around the bottom side of the high, pushing the storm toward the coast. And so I thought, this is a Friday afternoon. And back then, remember, most people didn't have mobile phones. So if you went to the Keys, you went out on your boat, whatever you did, and South Florida was a very, very recreational place then, I think even more so than now. You weren't going to be in communication. So I just thought Friday afternoon, we need to be sure people know that there's a potential threat this weekend. So we kind of blew up the early evening news, and we talked about the potential for having to get ready this weekend. It wasn't that I was forecasting the hurricane to come, but I was forecasting the possibility of having to get ready over the weekend on that Friday afternoon. And, then that morphed Friday night, but especially on Saturday, toward actually talking about the threat of the hurricane actually coming. Began Saturday, but then it happened Sunday night. So this was all like this. And, I stood there on Saturday just in front of the green screen, and they put a background there that had a phone number on it. And people could just call in with questions, and just stood there for hours and hours and hours with nothing but that. And then an advisory would come in, somebody would hand me a piece of paper, and I'd read the advisory. And sometimes we'd punch up the satellite picture, but then just continue on with the questions, which I found that to be really an effective way to communicate, which today we do with Facebook Live and things like that, of answering people's questions.
So what kind of question? What was a lot of the information that people wanted to know? What really stood out? What should I do with?
What should I do with my boat? My mother lives in a condo. It's a very strong building, but will she be okay? How about in Boca? How about in Key Largo? How about here? How about there? Well, of course, there were no answers, no specific answers, because, my cone at that time was all of South Florida, all the way to North Florida. And if you drew the angles all the way out, so it wasn't at all certain, but but basically by that time on Saturday, it was an intensifying hurricane. So we knew that some part of Florida was likely to have a very strong hurricane at that time. Actually, I did not think it would be South Dade. I didn't think that's where it was going. I thought that the odds favored it being farther north, somewhere maybe Palm Beach County, something like that. But close enough that Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami, they were all the same place, because nobody thought you could forecast whether the worst of it was going to be in Miami or Fort Lauderdale or West Palm 2 days out. You just didn't think you could do that. So if it was coming toward Southeast Florida, then everybody had to be on high alert.
So you say people were expecting a strong hurricane. I mean, here we are. We know it was a depression a day.
Well, this is 2 days in. I'm talking about 2 days in advance now. This is Saturday when it hits overnight, Sunday night, early Monday morning. So this is only a day and a half really that we're talking about. So, the storm was, by that time, had generally turned farther south. It was coming, in the direction of South Florida. The question was, is it going to veer to the north at all or not?
So what were they expecting intensity-wise? Because, intensity forecasts are still shaky today. Were you thinking this is going to be a big, strong storm? Or
I wasn't thinking it was going to be a Category 5. And, of course, remember, at the time that it all happened, it was analyzed as a Category 4 at that time. So now, because we have higher resolution ways of monitoring storms, we tend to know that they're stronger than we thought that they were back then, is my sense. So, we thought it would be a Category 3, could be a Category 4. By that time, by Saturday. I thought that somebody on the southern part of the peninsula was going to get a really bad hurricane. But remember, this was a little tiny storm. So sure, this could have threaded the needle back then, for instance, between North Broward and the Palm Beaches. Delray Beach, Boynton Beach, those places were not terribly populated, right? It could have threaded the needle somehow between the highly populated areas, for example. So I didn't know, but I didn't, because I didn't know, which is kind of a rule that I've had as long as I've been doing weather, that I accept the fact I don't know. So don't try and, forecast the unforecastable and get wound around the axle of something that you would really like to know, but don't know. So I didn't try and say, here's where it's going to go. It was more, here's what we have to do, which to me is the distinction between forecasting the weather and addressing the emergency, right? Well, one is, okay, what's the hurricane going to do? How strong is it going to be? Where's the worst of it going to be? What part of what county is going to get the worst of it, so forth, as opposed to, okay, based on what we know for sure, which is just that the hurricane is coming, and somebody's going to get it really bad, but we don't know who, what do we have to do about it? Right? That's sort of addressing the emergency as, way of communicating. And so I spent most of my time doing that. I said that when that Sunday came, so this was the day, I went to bed the night before, and I said, tomorrow is going to be one of the biggest days in the history of our city, so let's go home and get some sleep now, because we're going to have a long day and we may not sleep tomorrow night. And, indeed, obviously, that was the case. But once I sat down there at 9 o'clock in the morning and started that coverage that went, through until the next morning, I reflected many times that the specific weather forecast was a minor part of that programming. It wasn't the main thing. The main thing was, what are we going to do about it? Is okay, new advisories in. Does it tell us anything different about what we need to be doing? No. All right. So that was really what we spent the day and night doing, was, what do we need to be doing? And that, I think, was what people attached to my coverage even before later that night.
Yeah, I remember reading in your book about your conviction in telling people what to do. For example, there was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you guys had a chopper or some video out, and it was across a causeway, and there was some broke down trailer. I think it was a boat trailer. And it had a flat tire or something. And you say something along the lines of, if that were me behind there, I'd that boat out of the way. So you are, you're a lot of conviction there of, you guys need to get moving. This is it. Was that Saturday, or was that more into Sunday?
That was Sunday, I think. Yeah, that was on the MacArthur Causeway, or on 395 there, right by where today is the Performing Arts Center, the Arts Center down there in Miami, and I guess the trailer, either the wheel came off or had a flat tire or something like that, and by that time I had realized that the mayor was not going to be stepping up and kind of leading the way, and emergency management, Miami-Dade Emergency Management, really was having a lot of problems. I didn't know what the problems were, but I just knew that we weren't in communications with Kate Hale and her team out at the Emergency Management Center, which was out on Miller Road in Kendall. And it turned out that what happened was the 911 system in Dade County was set so that if the system overflowed, it overflowed to emergency management phones. So the phone system was essentially out at the emergency management office because so many people were calling 911 that as soon as they would hang up the phone, it would ring again, and they'd pick it up. Or if they try and wait and pick up the phone, somebody would be on the line. So they weren't able to make calls, and it was like a bunker. Even mobile phone calls you couldn't make from inside, and a lot of people didn't have mobile phones. So anyway, they were having a time of it in emergency management office. So I just decided that, I knew as much about this as pretty much anybody I knew. I'd been studying it for 2.5 years. So I decided that, somebody had to do it. So I was just going to say what I thought and deal with the consequences later. That the boat thing happened. They were still, I got a phone call or some kind of way it was communicated to me. I think somebody called the TV station. Somebody was taking messages and bringing messages out to the news set. Said, oh, by the way, they're still taking tolls on the turnpike. And, of course, the evacuation was underway. They said something like, could somebody get a hold of the governor and tell him to take the tolls off the turnpike? And somehow and it was almost a joke that I said it, but somehow I got credit for getting the tolls taken off the turnpike, which I'm sure that somebody else realized that wasn't a good idea in an evacuation. But
yeah, if nobody else says it, then
yeah. So anyway, but I that evolved when I realized that we weren't going to hear from the mayor. We weren't going to, nobody was going to be kind of telling us what's going on in that situation. It just was not a well-established system at that time. By later in the 90s, all of the emergency management systems were much better, and people got better at it, and the people changed. Mayor Pinellas, that came along in the later 90s, was very talented at it, so we felt much better informed.
What was the feeling like? I mean, a day or two before Andrew struck. I remember in Irma, it's a different storm. We watched this thing coming for days and days and days, and that probably played a part of it. But there was a mix of panic with camaraderie. I saw more people around my neighborhood than I think I've ever seen. People were they were there to help each other if needed. But what was it like then? Was it just sheer panic, or? I don't know.
No, because we hadn't had a hurricane in so long. Almost nobody had experienced a bad hurricane in South Florida. So it really wasn't. And remember, it came so fast. For the longest time, up through Friday, nobody thought that it was coming to Dade or Broward. You kind of assumed it was going farther north. But then on Friday, I was like, I'm not so sure. This is risky. And, I would not have done what I did that afternoon if it hadn't been Friday. If it had been Tuesday or something, I would have just waited till the next day. But because it was Friday and I thought a lot of people won't pay attention over the weekend, I needed to raise the flag, and make people aware. So I got credit for being the only one to forecast that Andrew was coming before anybody else did. And I didn't do that at all. I just, sort of risk evaluated that Friday and determined the risk was sufficient. But we didn't really think it was coming, so nobody was nervous. Saturday, when I called the Hurricane Center from home Saturday morning and said, okay, what's happened overnight? And they said, it's still coming. It's category 2 or 3 by that time. And our forecast is farther south. I said, oh, crap. Okay. So I ran into the TV station where I had access to the maps and whatnot. And, then we started that standing in front of the green screen coverage for most of the day and night.
So as far as the storm goes, I guess the shear had let up and it goes over the Gulf Stream at the same time, and that just blew this thing up. Is that what you think?
Well, the first thing that happened was the shear let up, and there was this big upper level low that was just ripping it apart, just ripping. And I gave it just a little on that previous Wednesday, 5 days out. I gave it just a little better than 50% chance of surviving, and if it survives, we're going to have to watch it. Is what I said that Wednesday. And that's when I first showed the cone. And so that was 5 days before it made landfall. And then Thursday it had come apart, but it was still kind of coming. And then Friday was tropical storm and so forth. So anyway, getting back to the sort of anxiety point, because we hadn't had, first of all, because it didn't have that long lead up like Irma had. Irma was like a freaking torture chamber because the cone was sort of aimed at South Florida for a week, it seemed like, right? And the models kind of aimed it at Florida for like a week, that it was coming this way. It was coming, it was coming, it was coming, it was coming, and so that was completely different than most people weren't even aware of it until Saturday, or some people were loosely aware of it on Friday, that it might be a threat. And then Saturday, it was the first time that anybody thought it was really a threat, but everybody thought, okay, I have Sunday to prepare, and they did. And so they prepared all day Sunday. Everybody was so busy, and by Sunday night, there were nobody on the road. Town was deserted. I mean, just quiet, hunkered down, waiting. And people thought, they had all day. People thought they were prepared. So in their minds, they were prepared, but, obviously they weren't prepared for that. And but because they thought they were prepared, I think that the anxiety leading up to it was drastically lower than now, when we have so much more awareness of, post-Andrew, of what a terrible hurricane can do. And, so I don't think general fear was the right description of the thing. Anxiety, maybe. Anticipation, more, I think.
Yeah. Blissfully unaware of maybe what was,
yeah.
They just couldn't fathom it, picture it, like you
say.
Okay,
so to finish your thought, though, Luke, so yes, the shear let up before it got to the Bahamas, but that was on Sunday. And so it blasted Eleuthera. Now, they estimate 170 mile an hour winds. Back then it was 150 was the estimate, and northern Eleuthera. And then, it was getting into Sunday evening, and toward the early, toward midnight, I guess maybe in the evening this was, that it was weakening. So it was going through an eye wall replacement cycle. Hurricanes were out there, yes, eye wall replacement cycle. Winds were down fairly significantly. And on the radar, it was in Miami radar range at the time. And so you could see that the eye was ragged, but I didn't talk about that. I didn't, and I really played down the idea that it was a little weaker because the Gulf Stream was up ahead, and what I was afraid of is that the eye wall replacement cycle pattern, the sort of dip in intensity and then increase in intensity the increase was going to coincide with the Gulf Stream. It kind of looked like that, just spitballing it. And the Hurricane Center actually mentioned in their discussion, I read later, I don't know why I didn't read it at the time, because I wasn't in the weather office, so I was only reading in all this massive papers on the desk, that the Gulf Stream was up ahead, so we're going to call for some intensification. But it intensified, more than anybody expected. But back then, you didn't have to, everybody didn't have the data at home. Now you would have to talk about what was happening on the radar and what the hurricane hunters were finding. But back then, it was like I didn't want anybody to sort of unprepare because, again, the risk was too high.
Sure. So tell me about your experience riding out the hurricane, because you're there at the station. There's the famous story of the bunker. You guys are in the bunker. What was all that like as Andrew came on in?
Well, so as the overnight is going on, what became clear now as it started moving over the Gulf Stream and intensifying, it became clear that this was going to be very, very extreme. This was going to be, peg in the needle, top of the charts, about as bad as it could be in South Dade. Now, I didn't know how far north South Dade meant at that time. Like, would Coral Gables be involved, or where exactly would it would be? But we could see it was south of downtown Miami, and how much downtown Miami would get was not completely clear at that time. But I could see the storm was clearly getting stronger, and then, and I think this was at about 3 a.m. on the radar, so you could see the eye filling in it became a kind of a solid orange. And I saw on the top of the eye this big blow up in red, which I said, oh, that's, which was a vortex. And I knew that was where bad damage was done in small storms, but in a very loose way. I mean, the understanding of the meteorology was not, I didn't have great understanding at that time of that or the evidence of it or anything. But I recognized that on the radar. I thought, okay, what can we do here? What are we going to do? Like everybody's kind of hunkered down. Now what can they do? And this is where the idea of getting the mattress off the bed and getting, in the closet, in the bathtub, mattress over you, that came from. And then I'm thinking, I'm looking up at the roof in the studio of this old building, and I go, I don't know about this roof. It's right up there. Maybe we shouldn't stay here. So I said on TV to the floor director, I said, maybe you could find us a safer place to be, a strong place where we could move. And as soon as I said it, I thought, wow, this is a good idea, because if we move, people are actually going to do what I said, which is move. Like, I didn't want people staying in their living room or their bedroom. I wanted people going to a hall, a closet, a bathroom, someplace where they had maximum security. Most, in tornado language, as many walls as possible between you and the outside, right? You want people to do. And so it turned out that in this old building that had started life as a movie theater, there was, behind the studio wall, there was a storage area that was kind of under the cement steps of the old movie. And the steps, I think, went up to the mezzanine. And it was just this perfectly made storage area. And they set up a news camera in there on a tripod and had a monitor that had the TV station on it and ran a telephone in there. And we sat on the cement step and, kind of rode the thing out, watching the radar on the monitor, knowing what was happening only by looking at that radar. That was it.
So what kind of information are you giving at that point? Just where the center of the storm is, who's in the worst of it? I mean, it seems like you're really kind of limited. What happens now is when a storm comes inland or comes ashore, it transitions into a news story. And the weather side, you'll come in and say, oh, the worst part of it's here. And then it goes back to the news side. Right. So what are you saying at this point?
Well, at that time, we were doing that in a way. But remember that there was no broadcasting from South Dade at that time. Nobody was in South Dade that could communicate with us. There was no communication to South Dade after the storm. So, and we didn't know it was going to South Dade. So, the reporters that had been deployed around town, the farthest south I think we had one was South Miami. And they had hunkered down in the news car under the Metro Rail there in South Miami. And the wind was whipping and rocking the news car. But it was all just on tape. At that time. Eventually, they got that video back, but nothing was in real time because the wind was blowing. I mean, you couldn't have a mast up on a truck. You couldn't have a satellite dish out if you had a satellite truck. There was just no way at that time to communicate, and mobile phones were not a big part of the plan. I don't remember anybody calling in on a mobile phone. So it was people calling in to the news department, telling us what was going on, and then somebody coming in or somebody going on camera and saying, one of the anchors would say, okay, we've got this information from Dade County Emergency Management or Broward Emergency Management or Miami-Dade Police or the fire or something, would be dispensing information to us that then one of the anchors would communicate, and then I might say, oh, let me add something to that, put that in perspective or something like that. So that was what we did for news coverage. It wasn't news coverage on location in the field, even though we had some video in the first part of the storm for sure. But once it really started going, it was just the radar until it died at 4:30. And we watched it die on TV. We watched the last sweep, and the sweep stopped.
Of just the Miami radar, right?
Just
you still had the West Palm.
we still, well, then after that, we switched to the West Palm. We never looked at the West Palm because it was a dial-up connection, so it was a low bandwidth connection. So we didn't have as good a resolution from West Palm, but we had good enough to see where the eye of the storm was. And we did not have any connection with Melbourne. The Melbourne radar was actually in. The new NexRad was actually installed and working in Melbourne. Second or third, one of those. Third, I think. And it turns out that you could see the hurricane with that far from Melbourne, 175 or 190 miles or something. But we didn't have a connection to that radar. So we just had the two kind of local ones.
So the ball that you mentioned that was going around the eye wall of Hurricane Andrew is a weird thing, right? Because, the worst part of the storm was actually stronger as it went inland, as it went ashore, because of that mesovortex. That's where the highest winds would be. And it wasn't on your, right front quadrant, right? Wasn't it rotating around the northwest side where some of the worst of the damage was done in Homestead? So a really bad confluence of events where that had just happened to rotate and be a wrecking ball right over Deep South Dade. Is that right?
Well, I don't know that it was that vortex, actually, because it was a weird storm, because the lowest pressure was not in the geometric center of the storm. The lowest pressure was north, as it was making landfall, was north, closer to that mesovortex in the northern eye wall. And so if you look at the way that the damage pattern of when the trees fell in South Dade, they fell from northwest to southeast, aiming toward the center of the eye. But, as if you could imagine the center being where the low pressure center was, which was in the north part of the donut. So things weren't falling in the right direction after the fact, in the analysis after the fact. So that did indeed make the right front quadrant very bad. But then another one formed that made the left back quadrant very bad too, and that's what blasted Homestead Air Force Base, for example. So part of South Dade got that front part, but then the other one that came up from the south and rotated around, that got a good part of Homestead on the back side of the storm. So again, if you see how the trees fell down there, they fell south to north.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the winds were, in the reanalysis, after it was found to be a Category 5, at 165 miles per hour. But the winds are the average of the rotation around the eye. They don't take into gusts, right? So
right.
These balls, these mesovortices that cause a lot of the damage, may have had gusts to 200 miles per hour, and they experience much higher, probably even sustained winds than 165. But by the way that the storm is classified, with the winds as an average around the eye, it's at 165. Do I have that right?
Yeah, well, remember, the nominal gust factor is about 40%, 30 to 40%. So if you take 165 and you add 30 or 40%, you're over 200 miles an hour from the get-go, right? But then exactly the phenomena that you talk about inside the mesovortex, whether they're sustained, average 1 minute, whatever they are, I mean, they were wicked winds. And so I think that the 165 understates the winds in Hurricane Andrew, because it seems to me that the damage that we saw in South Dade seems way more excessive than the damage in Camille, for example, in southern Mississippi, or the damage that we saw in Michael from wind. Now, storm surge damage was horrendous in both of those cases. But from wind, the Andrew damage, flipping cars over inside their garage, inside the house, stuff like that, was at a level that was just so off the charts. And I think, like you said, I think that all happened because of the mesovortex.
Well, tell me about a few of those, because there's the garage with the cars flipped over inside, which is really weird. Just the pictures from the National Hurricane Center are extremely intense with, the cars on the roofs that have been flopped over.
And that's way, and by the way, that was way outside of the eye wall. I was at the very, very, I think it was actually outside the northern edge of the eye wall. So, but the car came from way back in the parking lot and ended up sideways on top of the wall on top of this other car. And of course, the winds gusted over 163 on the top of the Hurricane Center before the anemometer failed. And I mean, they were crazy big, swings of wind speed in there. So that was probably related to that mesovortex, actually.
But you were telling me, we had a conversation just the other day about how there was other weird things that happened with Andrew that makes you think that it may have been stronger than Camille and Michael. And was there one with a board that was shot through a cinder block house or something?
Well, you
that.
had three of those. I mean, I don't know how many actually happened, but I mean, I have a picture that, it's a well-known picture, but the Baptist Hospital gave it to me at an event after Andrew of, palm tree there with a 2x4 way up. It had to be 20 feet up the palm tree, straight through the palm tree, a royal palm, sitting there pretty as you please with this big, huge 2x4 through it. And I have another picture of a piece of plywood that sliced through a palm tree end on. That was down in Homestead. And then, very unfortunately, this young girl that was really a wonderful young lady, she did a lot of volunteering at the at Metro Zoo, the Miami Zoo, Zoo Miami it's called now. And she was in her bedroom, and a 2x4 came through the concrete wall, and she died from that 2x4. I mean, so things were flying around at some crazy, insane, tornadic sort of way in that hurricane, and that's why I say that when you look at Camille, you look at the pictures of Camille, you still see there's some leaves on those pine trees. It's like they're not like the bark isn't stripped bare like it was in Andrew. So it lends you to believe that something was different about the wind in Andrew compared to Camille and Michael.
So the storm passes. What's the message, let's say the next day, about how bad it was or wasn't? Was it underplayed at first?
Oh, yeah. At first, the network people went on from New York and underplayed it significantly. Miami's dodged a bullet and that kind of thing. The network people that were in Miami had a pretty good understanding that something bad might have happened in South Dade, but there was no communications with South Dade. So the mayor of Miami, Xavier Suarez, at the time, came over to the TV station as soon as he could, at about 7:30 or so in the morning, and said, "Miami is okay. Miami's okay." So he was on TV. So people, that were network correspondents or watching on television, the mayor say Miami's okay, and I said, "Don't think because we haven't heard from South Dade that's good news." Because we hadn't heard from Cutler Ridge today, Cutler Bay. We hadn't heard from Homestead. We hadn't heard from Florida City. We hadn't heard from South Miami, I don't think. And we hadn't heard from Kendall. So during the storm, we'd heard from Kendall, and houses were coming apart. So I never thought it would be as bad as it was, but I knew that it was not good news. But as often happens, people report on where they are. So when you say Miami survived a bullet, well, they didn't lie. Miami did in a technical sense, right? But for those of us that live in South Florida, we know that it's a much bigger community, and South Dade, was part of that community, and there was no dodging a bullet that happened in any kind of way.
Now you go down there at some point. I don't know how many days it is, but when you're down there, what do you see? It's a hellscape, isn't it?
Well, yeah. The first thing was, so the storm happened on Monday morning, And it wasn't until, and when we got the helicopter, because I had said, we got to send this helicopter out of town. And I think the helicopter went to Orlando. So we had to get the helicopter back. And the helicopter came back in the afternoon, that afternoon. And so it was just the helicopter with extremely talented reporter, photographer. He was a photographer, but he was a very good storyteller as well, named Rob Pierce. Was in the helicopter with the lieutenant governor. So they flew, and they were on live, and we were talking to them live, and it was just, that was our first view of it. It was devastation as far as you could see. It was just sort of unbelievable. And I knew South Dade because I'd been in the helicopter a lot, doing neighborhood weather in the 80s, and really knew landmarks from the air. And normally you would find a shopping mall, or you'd find and an intersection, but the trees sort of, it was the openings in the trees that allowed you to see these things that became landmarks. So you'd know where Kendall Drive was, you knew where Coral Reef was, you knew various things, you knew where the Cutler Ridge Mall was. But with all the trees gone, you didn't have any reference to any of that. Everything kind of looked the same, and it all looked wrecked. So it was it was a frightening thing. And it wasn't until after 6 o'clock that they finally made it down to Homestead Air Force Base at that time, and we saw the planes had been ripped out of the hangars, and the few planes that were there, and the hangars were destroyed, and they were supposed to be hurricane-proof hangars. So it was, we knew that something ultra extreme had happened in Homestead when I saw that.
Mm. Now, on ground level, society is breaking down, right? I mean, people there don't have any help. They're living in horrible conditions. Can't imagine, what kind of crimes ongoing. What was going on at the ground?
Well,
and for a while, too.
Remember, the way Dade County was set up, and to some degree sort of still is in South Dade, the only really significant municipal entity in South Dade was the city of Homestead. And I seem to recall they had 28 cop cars in Homestead. And then Florida City is there, but it's a much smaller community, so that was not a big factor. And otherwise, it was all just unincorporated Dade County at that time. So the government was Dade County government run out of Miami. Well, as I recall the numbers, Homestead lost 27 of their police cars in the hurricane, and the City Hall and the police station were all, in terrible shape, and they hadn't have any communications, and so they were not able to function really as a governmental entity. Dade County didn't have communications, and they had different frequencies, such that they did have that the police were on different frequencies than the firefighters, and there were so many problems it was impossible. The governor came down, but the governor couldn't even communicate with his office, and there really was no plan to quickly deploy a large force down. He had called out the National Guard, but it wasn't anywhere near sufficient, and they didn't have the resources for what had happened in South Dade. So people that stayed there and stayed to protect what was left of their homes, had no power, no water, no communications, and no security. It was hellish, and for psychological reasons, I think people wanted to protect their homes, and so people stayed in really smashed houses, protecting very, very little, and would sit outside with guns, to all night and stay up for days at a time. And I mean, it was a horribly dangerous situation. Then you had looters, and we had looters live on TV, and it was really just unraveled completely. I remember thinking that Wednesday night when I left, so it happened Monday morning. So, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So 3 days had passed. Monday night, when I was on 12 hours a day from noon to midnight, when I went home or got off the air that night, I thought, I don't know what, maybe we have to just put up a wall and, figure out what's going to happen down there later. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I never experienced pure anarchy in, my life in the United States. I never saw that before. So I mean, I just didn't know. And then Thursday, Thursday early afternoon, the first C5A, I guess, the huge cargo jet, or cargo plane loaded with supplies and troops and whatnot, landed at Opelika. And I remember having tears in my eyes sitting on the set watching it happen, because that was the first time that there was, some kind of hope that something would get better. And finally it did Saturday. It took 2 days for them to get to South Dade, get set up, get their tents organized, and deploy, get a general in charge and on TV and saying, we're taking charge here and it's going to be okay. I mean, it was still horrible, but at least there was some semblance of security. One of the things you need to survive is security. They still didn't have power, water, or food, but the military was bringing those things as well.
Oh, so that's all it was. That's what I was going to ask, is that, people had, the ability to get water and, get a meal in their belly, but not the case. It was just security.
Well, that was the first thing, was security. And then they set up as quickly as they could the tent city in Homestead, in Harris Park there in Homestead. And so some people eventually moved in there out of their, destroyed homes. Other people found other places to live. And, slowly it became somewhat stabilized. But, I mean, it took a long time. I don't know if you were going to ask me about this, but I tell the story in the book of going down to the tent city to broadcast one afternoon. And I flew in the helicopter down there, as I recall, on that occasion. And I walked down the street and I was met there by a People magazine photographer. And he wanted to go into the neighborhood. And I said, yeah, I want to go see too. Because I assumed that everybody that was, kind of in dire shape would have come to the tent city. But went there, and there was this young woman, I don't know, she looked like she was in her late 20s, 30-year-old woman, something like that, standing there, and I went and talked to her, and, are you still living in your house? And yes, and would you like to come in and see? And yes, I would. And so we went in there, and first of all, the downstairs was all kind of wet. Everything was wet in there. And I thought, and then this little girl comes out, and she appeared to be, 6 or 7 years old or something, in bare feet. And she's walking around, there's glass and there's debris and everything. And the mother says, take a look upstairs. And I go up the steps of this townhouse, and you go up and you turn like that. I turned, and there was no roof. The whole top floor was gone. So what was happening is the rain, the water was kind of flooding down the steps, and they had this wet mattress in the living room. I mean, it was just horrid. And so, I said, you can go over here to the tent city, and they're going to take care of you. And she really didn't want to do that. She didn't want to leave home. And so there was this real attraction to hanging on to what little was left at home, and I went back and told the soldiers that, there's this woman down the street down here that really needs somebody to help her make good decisions with her child that's walking around in bare feet in this crazy, horrendous situation.
I remember reading the story within your book about, I think it's a year-ish. It's well after Andrew's done, and you're in the Keys, and you're doing some live weather report in the Keys, and somebody sees you, and there's some moment. You had an impact, and you guys are both, obviously very emotional about it. So I guess my question is, what impact did this have on you? I mean, you've seen so many people suffering. You're this hero figure, through luck and through hard work. You're the only guy that's on TV. It's just the way that it was. You're the one getting the message out. So was all this hard to manage?
Well, it was more, I felt responsibility that was hard to manage. I didn't, I always thought when I encountered these people, there, but for the grace of God go I, I just felt lucky that, okay, this was a lot of work, and this is, this has just affected my life tremendously. Every minute of every day I'm dealing with Hurricane Andrew. Everywhere I go, I deal with Hurricane Andrew. But I didn't go through what they went through. People that lived in South Dade and people that, thought they were going to die. I never thought I was going to die. So I really, I just thought, okay, I don't have any choice here. I got to do this. I got to do whatever it takes here to be the best I can about this. So I'm certainly not going to complain about the extra work that Hurricane Andrew brought into my life after, all of the people that I experienced that experienced an entirely different emotional level than I ever did.
Well, Bryan, it's quite a tale. But the story is not done. You still have a whole lot to tell, including your time with the Weather Channel, and you covered another megastorm, Superstorm Sandy. We're going to talk about that coming up in the next section.
Yeah, so that'll be next week. We'll have part 2, the rest of the story, so to speak. And this is all kind of self-indulgent, but I appreciate you sticking with it. All right, so be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your Apple or Android apps or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Or, of course, you can watch Twitter or Facebook, and then we'll post when the podcast is ready as well. And if you're listening right now on your phone or your podcast app and you'd like to see a video version of this podcast, you can do that too. Just go to local10.com/hurricane. On the right side of the page, you'll see the last several podcasts, and there you can click for either the audio or the video version. So for now, for Luke Doris, I'm Bryan Norcross. Stay safe, be well, be sure you're vaccinated, please, and we'll see you next week with part 2.